Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. Keir Starmer appeared sidelined at tonight's crunch meeting between Donald Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky, and other European leaders, as the Ukrainian leader begins the long negotiations for peace. Sir Keir made a last-minute decision on Sunday afternoon to jet out to Washington, D.C. for the talks, rumored to have been forced to cut a rare holiday short. However, appearing on camera this evening for a European leaders' discussion about peace in Ukraine, the British Premier appeared out in the cold, while French President Emmanuel Macron and Italian PM Giorgia Meloni flanked President Trump. Sir Keir was pushed to the far end of the table, awkwardly leaning in to see the U.S. president speak. The Prime Minister was also called to speak second last, despite claiming to have led efforts to U.S.-European diplomatic efforts after EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Ms. Meloni, and Mr. Macron. He only addressed the U.S. president before the leader of Finland. Mr. Trump declared this evening's meeting an historic first for the White House to host so many different heads of state, prime ministers, and presidents. Addressing President Trump, Sir Keir said all leaders present want lasting peace, noting the impact on Ukrainians, Europe, and the UK. When we talk about security, we're talking about the security not just of Ukraine, but the security of Europe and the United Kingdom as well, which is why it's such an important issue. I really feel we can, with the right approach this afternoon, make real progress, particularly on the security guarantees and your indication of security guarantees. Some sort of Article 5 style guarantee fits with what we've been doing with the Coalition of the Willing, which we started some months ago. With the U.S. coming alongside what we've already developed, I think we can take an historic step forward today for security in Ukraine and security in Europe. He outlined his hopes for the meeting will be greater clarity on what security guarantees the U.S. is now proposing to back the peace, and plans for a potential trilateral meeting between President Trump, President Zelensky, and President Putin. Speaking alongside President Zelensky in the Oval Office earlier this afternoon, Donald Trump gave a major update about the possibility of a trilateral meeting between himself, Volodymyr Zelensky, and Vladimir Putin. At the end of his meeting in the Oval Office with Mr. Zelensky on Monday, Mr. Trump said Putin was expecting a call from him. Asked whether any aspects of his conversation with Putin left him disappointed, the U.S. president replied, "We're going to have a phone call right after these meetings today, and we may or may not have a trilat. If we don't have a trilat, then the fighting continues, and if we do, we have a good chance. I think if we have a trilat, there's a good chance of maybe ending it. But he's expecting my call when we're finished with this meeting." The Ukrainian war leader said he is now ready for a trilateral meeting between himself and President Putin. However, Russia sparked confusion this afternoon when insisting President Putin had made no concessions to allow NATO countries to put their troops in Ukraine to uphold a peace, despite claims to the contrary from the U.S. yesterday. The country's foreign office said it does not see the deployment of NATO countries' troops to Ukraine as viable, taking particular aim at Britain. A spokesman fumed, "At a time when there is a genuine push for a comprehensive, fair, and lasting resolution to the conflict around Ukraine, including addressing its root causes, statements continue to emerge from London that not only contradict the efforts of Moscow and Washington, but also appear aimed at undermining them." This weekend, Sir Keir continued to insist that Ukraine is now on an irreversible path to NATO membership, adding that is not something Russia can have a veto against. Next, Starmer had not been scheduled to attend the Washington summit at all. Aides had insisted for weeks that the British Premier deserved a rare break, and he had been photographed only days earlier in Cornwall with his family, windswept but smiling, pint of ale in hand. But when news broke on Sunday afternoon that Zelensky and Trump would meet to discuss a potential trilateral involving Vladimir Putin, pressure in London mounted. Foreign Office officials urged the Prime Minister to make an appearance, lest Britain be excluded from shaping the next chapter of Europe's most devastating conflict since 1945. Starmer relented, cutting short his holiday and boarding a late-night RAF Voyager jet to Washington. Exhausted aides followed him across the Atlantic, briefcases bursting with position papers and drafts of speeches. Yet the decision proved costly. Arriving at the White House just hours before the evening summit, Starmer lacked the leverage others had spent days cultivating. Macron had spoken to Trump twice in the previous week. Meloni had already dined with Zelensky. Even EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had held a closed-door session with American security advisors. Britain's leader was late to the game, and it showed. Diplomatic protocol often hides behind carefully chosen words. But here, the choreography was merciless. Macron and Meloni, both smiling broadly, sat tight at Trump's shoulders as cameras whirred. Von der Leyen and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz occupied the other high-profile seats nearest the president. And then, stretching down the table like an afterthought, came the Scandinavian leaders, the Dutch, the Spanish Prime Minister. Only then, almost at the farthest edge, sat Starmer. Next to him was Finland's youthful premier, who was scheduled to speak last. The message was unmistakable. Britain, once America's special partner, was now peripheral. Optics matter, whispered one Brussels diplomat watching the live feed. And the optics tonight are devastating for Downing Street. Starmer looks like he's been benched. When the speeches began, the insult deepened. Trump first welcomed Macron, praising his vision for a strong Europe. He turned next to Meloni, who earned loud applause for her firm language on Russian aggression. Von der Leyen spoke of Europe's unity, while Merz reminded the room of Germany's financial commitment to Kyiv. Only then, after more than an hour of addresses, was Starmer invited to speak second last, just before Finland. Leaning into the microphone, voice hoarse from jet lag, he declared, "All leaders present want lasting peace. When we talk about security, we're talking not just about Ukraine, but the security of Europe and the United Kingdom as well." He pressed for clarity on Article 5-style guarantees, a reference to NATO's mutual defense pledge, and claimed Britain had been working with a coalition of the willing on security guarantees for Kyiv. But few in the room seemed to stir. Macron was scribbling notes. Trump, expression unreadable, leaned back in his chair. Zelensky nodded politely, but said nothing. It was an intervention that landed softly, almost forgotten as soon as it was spoken. The real drama came later, when Trump, seated comfortably with Zelensky in the Oval Office, addressed the press. "We want to have a phone call with President Putin right after these meetings today," he announced. "We may or may not have a trilateral. If we don't, the fighting continues. If we do, maybe we can end it. He's expecting my call when we're finished." The remark electrified the corridors of power. The trilateral Trump-Zelensky-Putin summit had seemed unthinkable months earlier. Now, the possibility of such a meeting dominated headlines. Zelensky, standing beside Trump, added with quiet urgency, "Ukraine is ready. I am ready. If Putin is ready, we can talk." Back in Moscow, however, officials dismissed reports of concessions. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued a caustic statement aimed directly at London, accusing Britain of contradicting the peace push. At a time when there is a genuine push for resolution, statements continue to emerge from London that appear aimed at undermining them, the spokesman fumed. For Starmer, it was another slap in the face. Britain not only sidelined in Washington, but publicly singled out by Moscow. Observers were quick to draw parallels to the Brexit years, when Britain's absence from EU summits left it isolated. "This is the clearest sign yet that the so-called special relationship is not what it used to be," said Dr. Amelia Rowntree, a historian of transatlantic relations. Starmer inherited a difficult hand, but he hasn't yet carved out a role for Britain that Washington respects. Critics at home pounced. Conservative MPs accused the Prime Minister of being out of his depth, while tabloids splashed photos of him leaning awkwardly across the table, captioned, "Britain at the kids' table." Even some Labour backbenchers muttered discontent, warning that Britain risked becoming a footnote in global diplomacy. Accounts from diplomats present painted a picture of a leader struggling to assert himself. When Macron and Trump locked into a 20-minute back-and-forth about sanctions and security guarantees, Starmer tried to interject but was waved aside until later. At another point, when Zelensky addressed the gathering in somber tones, Starmer shuffled notes, unsure whether to respond. "It wasn't hostile," said one European aide, but it was clear he wasn't central. Britain used to be the bridge between Europe and Washington. Tonight, that bridge was out of service. Even allies admitted Starmer looked weary. His voice cracked once, and he seemed to lose his place in his notes before recovering. "He needed a strong showing tonight," said one UK diplomat privately. "Instead, it felt like we were observers, not players."